As long as he fears or remembers insecurity, man is a competitive animal. Groups, classes, nations, and races, similarly insecure, compete as covetously as their constituent individuals, and more violently, as knowing less law and having less protection. Nature calls all living things to the fray. In the broil of Europe between the Reformation, 1517, and the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, this collective competition used religion as a cloak and a weapon for economic or political ends. When, after a century of struggle, the combatants laid down their arms, Christianity barely survived among the ruins. France suffered first and recovered first. Her religious wars of 1562 to 1594 were to her what the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, was to be to Germany, and the Civil Wars, 1642 to 1648, to England. When Henry II died in a tragic joust in 1559, and his 15-year-old son succeeded him as Francis II, the nation had been led to bankruptcy by the long contest between the Habsburgs and the Valois kings. The gross annual revenue of the government was then 12 million livres. The public debt was 43 million. Many magistrates had been unpaid for 4 years past. The French people could not be persuaded to pay taxes. A financial crash threw Lyon into economic chaos in 1559. The flow of American silver and gold through Spain and Portugal into France depreciated the currency, inflated prices, and set on foot an angry race between wages and prices, in which no one gained but the informed and speculative financiers. In 1567 and 1577, the government tried by edict to fix maxima for prices and wages, but the economic scramble overrode the laws, and inflation went on, perhaps as an impious way to pay for pious wars. The only prosperous organization in the country was the Catholic Church, with its 94,000 ecclesiastics in 1600, its 80,000 nuns, its 70,000 monks or friars, its 2,500 Jesuits, its august cathedrals and stately episcopal sees, its extensive and well-cultivated lands. A third, some said two-thirds, of the riches of France belonged to the Church. Behind the religious wars lay the desire to retain or obtain this ecclesiastical wealth. Fortunately for the Church, Charles de Guise, who had been made Cardinal of Lorraine at 35, was now chief minister to Francis II. The ducal family of the Guises took its name from their castle near Laon, but had its main seat in Lorraine, which had only recently been absorbed into France. The cardinal was handsome, of alert intelligence and decent life, a good administrator, eloquent in Latin, French, and Italian. But his taste for wealth and power, his suave duplicity, his readiness to persecute dissent and avenge opposition, his courageous retrenchment of governmental outlays, made him enemies in almost every class. His older brother, Francis, Duke of Guise, had already earned renown in strategy and battle and was now Minister of War. But as the national bankruptcy counseled peace, Francis had to nurse his ambitions in a galling idleness. He loved glory, fine raiment, and cavalier display, but his courtly manners and grace of person and carriage made him the idol of Catholic France. He was intolerant of heresy and proposed to exterminate it by force. He and his brother were convinced that if France, like Germany and England, adopted Protestantism, the Church would be near its end, and France would lose the religious ardor that had supported its social order and its national unity. In defense of their faith and their power, the Guises braved many perils, suffered premature death, and shared responsibility for the harrowing of France. The Huguenots were no longer a small and helpless minority of French Protestants led and inspired by Calvin from Geneva, but a spreading doctrinal and social revolt against the Church. Calvin reckoned them to be 10% of the French people in 1559. Michelet estimated their numbers to have doubled by 1572. They had centers in every province, from Dauphiné to Brittany, above all in southwest France, where, 3 centuries back, the Albigensian heresy had met with apparent extermination. Despite the repressive legislation of Francis I and Henry II, they held their prayer meetings, fed on solemn sermons preaching predestination, issued a fire of pamphlets on the abuses of the Church and the tyranny of the Guises, and held a general synod in Paris on May 26, 1559, under the very nose of the king. They professed loyalty to the French monarchy, but they organized on republican lines the regions where they prevailed. Like any persecuted minority, they formulated a temporary ideology of liberty, but they agreed with the Catholics that the state should enforce the true religion throughout France. Their ethical theory was stricter than the time-relaxed code of their enemies. They avoided dancing, fancy dress, and the theater, and they denounced with indignation the morals of the court, where, as Jeanne d'Albret told her son, "It is not the men who invite the women, but the women who invite the men." The Queen Mother, Catherine de Médicis, thought that in both parties religion is a cover which serves merely to mask ill will, and yet they have nothing less than religion in their hearts. She may have put it too strongly, but unquestionably social and economic factors underlay the religious strife. The peasantry remained Catholic. It had no material stake in the contest, and saw no substitute in a stern predestinarian Protestantism for the comforting myths and festival alleviations provided by the ancient faith. The proletariat, small numerically but big with revolt, denounced its employers and gave a sympathetic hearing to the reform as promising some change. And as in the England of the Lollards and the Puritans, and the Germany of the Peasants' War, the gospel became a textbook of revolution. The middle classes, too, gave ear to the courageous preachers that Geneva trained and sent to France. The businessmen, who at the great fairs met prosperous Germans, Englishmen, and Swiss, noted the successful alliance of these merchants with Protestant rulers and ideas. They had long suffered contumely under bishops and barons disdainful of commerce and tied to feudal ways. They learned with pleasure and envy that Calvin was well disposed toward business and finance, and that he gave a share to the laity in the control of morals and the church. They resented ecclesiastical wealth and tithes, and feudal tolls on trade. They could not forgive the monarchy for subjecting to the central government the municipal communes that had for centuries been their political preserve. Even bankers smiled on the Huguenots, who raised no eyebrows at the taking of interest, upon which the Church had immemorially frowned, though lately winking a solemn theological eye. Many nobles were taking up the rebel cause. They, too, were unreconciled to the centralization of power in a unified state. They must have heard of territorial German princes who, in league with Protestantism, had been able to defy emperors and popes and had enriched themselves with the spoils of the Church. What if these doughty Huguenots could serve as a timely tool for chastening and subordinating the king? The nobles controlled the fields, the crops, and the peasantry of France. They organized and led her regiments. They held her fortresses. They governed her provinces. If the reform won the aristocracy, it would have a nationwide power at its back. Already in 1553, the Cardinal of Lorraine had warned Henry II that the nobility were defecting to the Huguenots. In Normandy, Brittany, Poitou, Anjou, Maine, Saintonge, by 1559, nobles were openly leading the Huguenot revolt. Proud Bourbon families had not forgiven the ruling Valois dynasty for driving Charles, Duke of Bourbon, to treason and an early death in 1527. Nor did they relish their exclusion from the French government by the clannish Guises, whom they looked upon as foreigners from a Lorraine that was far more German than French. Louis I de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, descended from King Louis XI, was of royal blood, far superior in rank to the Guises. He joined the Huguenots and died in the attempt to rise to power on the wave of their faith. His brother, Antoine de Bourbon, titular King of Navarre, but actually ruling only the province of Béarn in southwest France, played on the Huguenot side for a while, largely under the influence of his wife, Jeanne d'Albret. Jeanne was the aggressive daughter of the gentle Marguerite of Navarre, who had remained outwardly orthodox in deference to her brother, Francis I, but had protected many a heretic and Huguenot. As the mother had represented the Renaissance in love of life and poetry, so Jeanne exemplified the role and the character of women in the French Reformation, fervent in their religion to the point of intolerance, rearing and dedicating their children to carry on the holy war to death or victory. She brought up her famous son, the future Henri IV, to every Spartan and Puritan virtue, and did not live to see him revert to the lax gaiety of the Renaissance. She must have admired intensely Gaspard de Coligny, for he was all that she idealized. A nobleman in title and character, a prudent but loyal leader of the Huguenot cause, a stern soldier-statesman whose blameless morals shamed the gilded infidelities of the court. Calvin had cautioned his Huguenot followers against violent resistance to the government, but their patience withered in the heat of persecution. Henry II had ordered all judges to issue the death penalty against persistent Protestants in June 1559. Francis II, urged on by the Guises, renewed this edict and added that all buildings in which Reformed assemblies met should be demolished, that all persons, even relatives, who sheltered a condemned heretic or failed to report him to the magistrates, should also suffer death. In the last 5 months of 1559, 18 persons were burned alive for unrepentant heresy or for refusing to attend Mass or receive Catholic communion. Hundreds of French Huguenots fled to Geneva, where Calvin succored them. Those who remained in France began to organize themselves for civil war. On December 23, 1559, Anne du Bourg, who had dared in the Parlement of Paris to condemn persecution for heresy, was burned at the stake. Soon thereafter, Gaspard de Eu was strangled in the Château de Vincennes by the order of the Guises. His brother-in-law, Godefroy de Barry, Seigneur de la Renaudie, conspired with nobles and others to capture and depose the Guises in a coup de main to be effected at Amboise. The Cardinal of Lorraine discovered the plot, mobilized troops, overcame and arrested the conspirators, hanged some, beheaded some, flung others into the Loire in sacks. For a whole month, said a contemporary chronicle, there was nothing but hanging or drowning folks. The Loire was covered with corpses. This in March 1560. Condé was summoned to the royal court to answer charges of complicity. He came, denied them, and challenged any accuser to trial by combat. No evidence was adduced against him, and he was left free. Disturbed by this tumult of Amboise, the high rank of the conspirators, the ferocity of the suppression, and the fever of revenge that agitated Huguenots and nobles, Catherine persuaded the weakling king and the reluctant Guises to allow a trial of toleration. She called Michel de l'Hôpital to the post of Chancellor in May 1560 and bade him pacify France. As a student in Italy, Michel had learned to be a humanist rather than a dogmatist. As a magistrate in France, he had treated Catholics and Protestants with equal mercy and consideration. Now he proposed to the Parlement the views which had led Dubourg to the stake. Every man hath made a religion for himself. Some desire that their religion should be accepted and the faith of the rest hunted down. We must try to deal gently with one another, to invent a modus vivendi. Following his lead, Catherine summoned an assembly of notables, consisting of both Catholics and Protestants, which met at Fontainebleau on August 21, 1560. Coligny there presented to the king a petition from the Huguenots, affirming their loyalty but asking for full freedom of worship. Some bishops called for moderation on both sides and urged the clergy to reform their morals. The assembly decided that the problems involved required a convocation of delegates from all sections and classes of France. The king ordered such a States General to meet on December 10th, and meanwhile forbade any trials for heresy till the new gathering could pass upon the basic issues that were dividing the country. The Huguenot Bourbons, fearing arrest, had refused to attend the assembly of notables. Skeptical of conciliation, the Prince of Condé and Antoine de Bourbon plotted to raise an army and set up an independent state with Lyon as its capital. One of Condé's couriers was intercepted by the government. The papers found on him revealed the conspiracy. Condé was arrested, tried, and condemned to be executed on December 10th. The Guises resumed dictatorial power. Suddenly the situation was changed by the death of Francis II on December 5th, aged 16. His brother, Charles IX, succeeded to his formal power, but, being only 10 years old, he accepted the regency of his mother, who now joined Elizabeth of England and Philip II of Spain in guiding the chaos of Europe to their rival ends. 2. Catherine de Médicis. She is still a puzzle, after 4 centuries of conflicting interpretations. Descended from Lorenzo the Magnificent, grand-niece of Pope Leo X, she was a typical Medici, with government in her heritage and subtlety in her blood. Born in Florence in 1519 of parents who both died of syphilis before she was a month old, she remained a helpless and movable pawn in the diplomacy of her embattled relatives until her uncle, Pope Clement VII, gave her, aged 14, in marriage to the future Henry II of France. For 10 years she remained barren, while her sombre mate devoted himself to Diane de Poitiers. Then children emerged from her almost annually, 10 in all. She hoped and schemed to get them thrones. 3 of them died in childhood, 3 became kings of France, 2 became queens. Nearly all of them tasted tragedy, but herself most of all, who lived through the deaths of her husband and 3 successive royal sons. Queen or queen mother, she bore the vicissitudes of 4 reigns and survived them by prudence, self-control, and unscrupulous duplicity. A contemporary described her as a beautiful woman when her face is veiled. That is, she had a fine figure, and Brantôme assures us that her bosom was white and full, her thigh very beautiful, and her hands and fingers exquisite. But her features were rugged, her eyes too big, her lips too thick, her mouth too large. If she seduced men, it was by proxy. Rumor accused her of keeping about her an escadron volant, or flying squadron of pretty women who might bring men around to her purposes. But this was apparently a fiction. Wounded by Diane's dominance in policy as in love, she found revenge, after Henry's death, by making herself for 30 years the power behind the throne. Her finesse had to atone for the incompetence of her sons. They resented her interference, but their failure as kings compelled it. Cast into the maelstrom of a religious revolution, surrounded by aggressive nobles and intolerant dogmatisms, she fought with the only weapons she had: Medicean money, Italian acumen, Machiavellian diplomacy. Machiavelli had dedicated the prince to her father. Catherine hardly needed its instruction, for she had seen its principles practiced everywhere in Italy and France. Like Elizabeth of England, she outplayed all the statesmen around her, beat them at lying, had more wiles than all the council of the king. She worked hard and ably at administration. "Nothing is done without her knowing it," said an Italian observer. "Scarcely has she time to eat," though somehow she achieved obesity. Her personal morals were above her time. She seems to have been faithful to her unfaithful husband and to his memory. After his death, she wore mourning to the end of her life. Her greatest successor, Henry IV, judged her leniently. I ask you, what could a woman do, left by the death of her husband with 5 little children on her arms, and 2 families in France who were thinking of grasping the crown? Ours, the Bourbons, and the Guises. Was she not compelled to play strange parts, to deceive first one and then the other, in order to guard, as she did, her sons, who successively reigned through the wise conduct of that shrewd woman? I am surprised that she never did worse. We may accept this as a fair appraisal of Catherine's behavior before 1570. Surrounded by these rival families and forces, she played them off against each other. "God willing," she wrote, "I shall not let myself be governed either by one party or the other, having learned only too well that they all love God, the king, and myself less than their profit, and the satisfaction of their ambition." She was too much of a Renaissance Italian to savor the predestinarian severity of the Huguenots. Besides, she was asking the Church for a loan to stave off state bankruptcy. Nevertheless, she was ready, for France's sake, to marry her daughter Marguerite to the Huguenot Henry of Navarre, and her son Henry to the excommunicated Elizabeth. She saw the situation in dynastic and political rather than in religious or economic terms. She had to protect her divided country against the Habsburg Union of Spain and Austria. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis had left the Spanish power supreme in Flanders and encroaching dangerously upon northeastern France. At any moment the old War of Valois and Habsburg might flame again, and then France would need Huguenot as well as Catholic blood and arms. External danger demanded internal peace. In this frame of mind, she and her chancellor, L'Hôpital, prepared to meet the States General at Orléans. The states were not regions but classes: the nobility, the clergy, and as the tiers-état, the remainder of France. Principally the bourgeoisie or middle classes of the towns or boroughs, but also, in some modest representation, the peasantry and the incipient proletariat. Chosen by local and class powers rather than by any wide suffrage, the delegates had in theory no legislative authority, but only the right to advise the monarch. However, his need for funds gave the advice some force. L'Hôpital opened the session, on December 13, 1560, with an idealistic appeal for mutual toleration. It was the function of government, he urged, to maintain peace, order, and justice among all citizens impartially, without regard to their religious opinions. It was desirable that all Frenchmen should have the same religion, for this would favor national unity and strength. But if such a general agreement could not be peacefully reached, toleration became advisable. Who, after all, he asked, knows what is heresy and what is truth? You say your religion is the better. I say mine is. Is it any more reasonable that I should adopt your opinion than that you should adopt mine? Let us end these diabolical names, these partisan tags and factions and seditions. Lutherans, Huguenots, Catholics, let us change our name to Christians. The response was not cordial. A doctor of the Sorbonne, then the Faculty of Theology in the University of Paris, demanded the death penalty for all heretics, and the papal nuncio advised Catherine to begin by burning all the Huguenot delegates, then all the Huguenots in Orléans. The Huguenot delegates proposed to the Queen Mother a variety of reforms, that all pastors should be chosen by their congregations, that bishops should be chosen by the pastors and the nobles of the diocese, that a third of ecclesiastical revenues should go to relief of the poor, and another third to the building of churches, hospitals, and schools, and that the doctrine of the Church should be limited to Scripture. This was a bit too advanced for Catherine, who needed church money desperately. She appeased the Huguenots by freeing the imprisoned Condé and urging Pius IV to allow the removal of religious images from churches and the administration of the sacrament in wine as well as bread. On January 28, 1561, she released all persons arrested for religious offenses and ordered an end till further notice of all prosecutions for religion. On the 31st, she prorogued the States General to reassemble in May and meet her needs for funds. The Huguenots expanded in this sunshine. On March 2nd, they held at Poitiers their second national synod. Protestant ministers preached freely in the apartments of Condé and Coligny at the court of Fontainebleau. At Castres, in South France, a municipal election, on January 1st, 1561, gave all offices to Protestants. Soon thereafter, all citizens were ordered to attend Protestant services. Catholic services were forbidden. Religious images were officially condemned to be destroyed. At Agen and Montauban, the Huguenots took over unused Catholic churches. The old Constable Anne de Montmorency formed with the Duke of Guise and Marshal de Saint-André a triumvirate to protect the Catholic interest on April 6, 1561. Riots flared up at Paris, Rouen, Beauvais, and elsewhere. The Queen issued an Edict of July in 1561 forbidding violence in public Huguenot services. The Huguenots ignored the edict. In various towns they attacked Catholic processions, entered Catholic churches, burned relics, and smashed images. At Montpellier, in the autumn of 1561, all the 60 churches and convents were sacked, and many priests were killed. At Montauban, the convent of the Poor Clares was burned down, and the nuns were dispersed with the advice to get themselves husbands. At Carcassonne, the Catholics slaughtered all available Protestants. At Nîmes, the Huguenots expelled all priests, appropriated or destroyed all Catholic churches, burned down the cathedral, and trampled the consecrated host underfoot. This in February 1562. Generally, in Languedoc and Guyenne, the Huguenots, when they gained the upper hand, seized Catholic churches and property and expelled the Catholic clergy. Huguenot ministers, though more exemplary in their personal morals than the Catholic priests, quite equaled them in intolerance. They excommunicated Huguenots who were married by Catholic priests or who allowed their children to marry Catholics. Neither side saw any sense in toleration. The States General resumed its sittings on August 1, 1561, this time at Pontoise. It offered funds to the government on condition that its consent should thereafter be prerequisite to any levy of new taxes or any declaration of war. The Third Estate, now chief provider of funds, added a bold request that the entire property of the Catholic Church in France should be nationalized, that the clergy should be paid by the state, and that out of the surplus of 72 million livres thus obtained, 42 million should go to the liquidation of the public debt. The Catholic clergy, frightened, made a hurried peace with Catherine by offering her 16,600,000 livres to be paid cautiously in 10 annual installments. She accepted, and the States General was dissolved. Meanwhile, L'Hôpital, with Catherine's consent and over the protest of the Pope, had invited Catholic and Protestant clergymen to meet and seek some formula for pacification. 6 cardinals, 40 bishops, 12 doctors of the Sorbonne, 12 canonists, 10 Protestant ministers from France, 1 from England, Théodore de Bèze from Geneva, and 20 Protestant laymen met at Poissy, 11 miles west of Paris, for the famous Colloquy of Poissy on September 9, 1561. The king, the queen mother, the princes of the blood, and the council of state attended in all their dignity. Bèze, representing the aged Calvin, was received with almost royal honors. He held a reformed service and preached in Catherine's palace. He spoke at first moderately and charmed all with his perfect French, but when he remarked that in the Eucharist the body of Christ is as far removed from the consecrated bread as heaven is from earth, the Catholic delegates cried out in protest, and turmoil ensued. The bishops urged the banishment of all preachers who questioned the real presence, and the colloquy broke up with the conflict of dogmas embittered and unappeased. It was the merry wont of the Huguenots to hold their meetings in a public square confronting a Catholic church, and to disturb the Mass with lusty psalms. The Catholics in turn drowned out the psalmody by ringing the steeple bell. At Paris, a Protestant assemblage before the church of Saint-Médard was nullified by a mighty clangor from the campanile. A Protestant who entered the church to protest was killed. In fury, the Protestants sacked the building and smashed the statues and the crucifix. In the resultant battle, 80 worshippers were wounded, this on December 27, 1561. Catherine thought to mollify the Catholics by her Edict of January in 1562, which required the Huguenots to surrender all ecclesiastical buildings to their former owners and to hold their assemblies only outside the town walls. The Catholic leaders agreed with Bèze that this was in effect an Edict of Toleration, which recognized Protestantism as a legal religion in France. Parlement leaders told Catherine to her face that they would die rather than register the edict. When Montmorency and Saint-André condemned her policy, Catherine dismissed them from the court, and when Cardinal de Tournon fulminated against her, she retired him to his diocese. Catholic preachers denounced her as a Jezebel, the same term that Protestant Knox was then applying to the Catholic Queen of Scots. On Sunday, March 1st, 1562, Francis, Duke of Guise, passing with a band of 200 armed retainers through the village of Vassy, some 40 miles northwest of Dijon, stopped in a church there to hear Mass. The psalm-singing of Huguenots meeting in a nearby barn disturbed the service. He sent a messenger to ask them to defer their songs for 15 minutes till the Mass should be finished. They found this too inconvenient. While Guise continued his worship, some of his retainers exchanged sectarian compliments with the Huguenots. The retainers drew their swords. The Huguenots threw stones. One stone struck Guise as he left the church and drew ducal blood. His followers dashed into the assemblage of 500 men, women, and children, killed 23 and wounded 100. The massacre of Vassy roused the Protestants of France to martial fever. The Catholics, especially in Paris, hailed it as a timely chastening of a troublesome minority. Catherine ordered Guise to come to her at Fontainebleau. He refused and went on to Paris. Montmorency and Saint-André joined him on the way with 2,000 men. Condé ordered his Protestant levies to assemble in arms at Meaux. The Catholic triumvirate marched in force to Fontainebleau, captured the Queen Mother and the royal family, and compelled them to stay at Melun, 27 miles from Paris. They formed a new privy council, chiefly of Guise's men and excluding L'Hôpital. Condé led his 1,600 warriors to Orléans and called upon all reformed congregations to send him troops. The first of the religious wars began in April 1562. 3. Arbitrament of blood, 1562 to 1570. Both sides sought and received foreign aid, the Catholics from Spain, the Protestants from England and Germany. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1. The Story of Civilization, Volume 7, The Age of Reason Begins, by Will and Ariel Durant. Part 2, continued. Cassette 2, Side 1. Both sides sought and received foreign aid, the Catholics from Spain, the Protestants from England and Germany. Elizabeth, bribed by the promise of Calais, sent 6,000 men. 2,000 of these took Rouen, But Guise captured and sacked the city on October 26, 1562, and his spoils-hungry soldiers pillaged and slaughtered Catholic and Protestant inhabitants impartially. In these actions, Antoine de Bourbon, who had joined the Catholic faith and forces, was mortally wounded. The Huguenots took control of most towns in South France, sacking churches and smashing images religiously. Their main body of 17,000 men, under Condé and Coligny, marched toward Normandy to unite with the English reinforcements. At Dreux they were intercepted by a Catholic army of 17,000 under the Triumvirs. On December 19th, a furious battle was fought, which left 6,000 dead on the field. Saint-André was killed, Montmorency was wounded and captured by the Huguenots, Condé was wounded and captured by the Catholics. For a time, French courtesy prevailed. Montmorency was treated as a hero, who, though commander-in-chief of the king's armies, had always fought in the ranks and had been wounded in 7 battles. And the Duke of Guise used Condé as an honored guest, dined with him, and shared with him the only bed available in the camp. The indecisive victory went to the Catholics, but Paris and the royal family for a time believed that the Huguenots had won. Catherine took the news calmly, saying, "Very well, then, we shall pray to God in French." Guise himself met death in the aftermath of victory. While deploying his army to besiege Orléans, he was shot in ambush by Jean Poltrot de Marais on February 18, 1563. Marais was a 19-year-old Huguenot. The Duke died after 6 days of pain. Poltrot, brought before Catherine, asserted that Coligny had hired him for a large sum to murder Guise, and that Bèze had promised him paradise if he succeeded. Catherine wrote to Coligny asking for his answer to the charge. He denied any part in the assassination plan. He had often warned the Duke to beware of assassins. He admitted that he had heard Poltrot declare his intentions and had done nothing to deter him. He had given Poltrot 100 crowns, but for other purposes. However, he was not sorry that the plot had succeeded. For fortune can deal no better stroke for the good of the kingdom and the Church of God, and most especially it is good for myself and my house. Poltrot was torn apart by horses on March 18th. In his dying agony he renewed his accusation of Coligny. Henry, now 3rd Duke of Guise, swore to avenge his father's death. Catherine continued to work for peace. It was quite clear that either faction, if decisively victorious, would set her aside and possibly depose her son. She called L'Hôpital back to her council, arranged a meeting of Montmorency and Condé, and persuaded them to sign the Edict of Amboise, ending the First Religious War, on March 19, 1563. The terms were a victory for the Huguenot nobles only. Liberty of conscience and practice of the religion called Reformed were granted for all barons and lords, high justiciary in their houses, with their families and dependents, and for nobles having fiefs without vassals and living on the king's lands, but for them and their families personally. The Huguenot worship was to be allowed in towns where it had been practiced before March 8, 1563. Otherwise it was to be confined to the outskirts of a single town in any seneschalty or bailiwick. In Paris it was altogether forbidden. Coligny charged Condé with having sacrificed the Huguenot rank and file to protect his class. On September 15th, Charles IX, who was not yet 14, was declared of age. Catherine surrendered her regency, but not her leadership. In March 1564 she led the king and the court on a progress through France, partly to show the nation its new monarch, partly to consolidate the fragile peace. At Roussillon she issued an edict of partial toleration, calling upon each faith to respect the liberty of the other. After 14 months of royal touring, the party reached Bayonne on June 3, 1565, where Catherine greeted with joy her daughter Elizabeth, now Queen of Spain, and conferred with the Duke of Alva in secret parleys that alarmed the Huguenots. They rightly suspected that Alva counselled full forcible measures against them, but his extant letters to Philip make it clear that Catherine rejected his proposals, refused to dismiss L'Hôpital, and still clung to her policy of peace. Soon after her return to Paris, in December 1565, she used all her influence to reconcile Coligny, Montmorency, Condé, and the Guises. In 1564 the Jesuits entered France. Their sermons roused the ardor of the Catholics, and in Paris especially they converted a number of Huguenots. In the provinces, a strong Catholic reaction nullified many Protestant gains. The edicts of toleration were repeatedly violated, and barbarity flourished under both dispensations. It was not unusual for Catholic magistrates to hang citizens merely for being Huguenots. At Nîmes, the Protestants massacred 80 Catholics in 1567. Between 1561 and 1572, there were 18 massacres of Protestants, 5 of Catholics, and there were over 30 assassinations. Catherine imported mercenaries from Switzerland and gave no satisfactory answer when Condé asked for what she intended to use them. Believing that their own lives were in danger, Condé and Coligny, with armed followers, tried to seize the king and the queen mother at Meaux in September 1567, but Montmorency foiled the attempt. Catherine now feared Coligny as once she had feared Guise. Coligny and Condé felt that a second war was needed to restore even the limited rights of the Huguenots. They, in their turn, imported mercenaries, chiefly from Germany, to reinforce their depleted armies. They captured Orléans and La Rochelle and marched on Paris. Catherine asked Alva for reinforcements. He sent them at once, and at Saint-Denis, just outside the capital, Montmorency led 16,000 men against Condé's troops in one of the bloodiest and least decisive battles of these wars. Montmorency died of his wounds. France again wondered what religion was this that led men to such slaughter, and L'Hôpital seized the opportunity to arrange the Peace of Longjumeau on March 23, 1568, which restored the modest toleration granted in the Edict of Amboise. The Catholics denounced the treaty and refused to carry out its terms. Coligny protested to Catherine. She pleaded impotence. In May 1568, the Spanish ambassador at Rome, Juan de Zuniga, reported that he had heard from Pope Pius V that the French government was considering the assassination of Coligny and Condé. The two Huguenot leaders may have had similar information. They fled to La Rochelle, where they were joined by Jeanne d'Albret and her son, now 15 years old and itching for action. A new Huguenot army was formed, a fleet was collected, the walls were fortified, and all attempts of government forces to enter the city were repulsed. English private vessels accepted Condé's commission, flew his flag, and made prey of any Catholic property they could seize. Condé was now virtually sovereign south of the Loire. Catherine looked upon this third religious war as a revolution, as an attempt to divide France into two nations, one Catholic, the other Protestant. She reproached L'Hôpital for the failure of his conciliation policies. He resigned. She replaced him as chancellor with an uncompromising partisan of the Guises. On September 28, 1568, the government repealed the Edicts of Toleration and outlawed the Reformed faith from France. All that winter, the rival forces prepared for a decisive engagement. On March 3, 1569, they met at Jarnac, near Angoulême. The Huguenots were defeated. Condé, exhausted with wounds, surrendered but was shot from the rear and died. Coligny took command and reorganized the troops for an orderly retreat. At Moncontour, the Huguenots were again defeated, but Coligny recovered by strategy what had been lost in battle, and without victories, almost without food, the undiscourageable Huguenots advanced to within a few hours' march of Paris in 1570. Despite subsidies from Rome and Spain, the government found it difficult both to finance its armies and to keep the Catholic nobles in the field for more than a month or two at a time. Meanwhile, hordes of mercenaries devastated the country, pillaging Catholics and Protestants indiscriminately and killing all who dared resist. Catherine offered Coligny a renewal of the Treaty of Longjumeau. He refused it as inadequate and continued his advance. At this point, the youthful Charles IX suddenly asserted his authority and signed at Saint-Germain, on August 8, 1570, a peace that gave the oft-defeated Huguenots more than they had ever gained before: freedom of worship except in Paris or near the court, full eligibility to public office, and as a guarantee that these terms would be honored in practice, the right to hold 4 cities under their independent rule for 2 years. The Catholics fumed and wondered why such a surrender followed so many victories. Philip and the Pope protested. Catherine turned them off with the assurance that she was only biding her time. Nevertheless, she proceeded to strengthen the new peace by offering to marry her daughter, Marguerite of Valois, to Henry, King of Navarre, now, since Condé's death, the titular head of the Huguenots. It was Catherine's last and boldest stroke. No matter that she and Jeanne d'Albret were sworn foes, no matter that Henry had already slain his quota of Catholics in war, he was young and malleable. Perhaps the magic of a beautiful and vivacious princess would woo him from his heresies. There would be a magnificent wedding feast at Paris. Men and women of either faith would be invited. The gay Renaissance would revive amid the bitter Reformation. There would be a moratorium on theology and war and massacre. 4. Massacre. But would Henry's mother consent? Jeanne d'Albret was Huguenot in body and soul. Coming to the court in 1561, she declared that she would not go to Mass if they killed her. She would sooner throw her son and her kingdom into the sea than yield. On the contrary, she had her Huguenot chaplain preach to her with all doors open, and defiantly ignored the recriminations of the Parisian populace. When her husband was converted to Catholicism, she left him and the court in 1562, returned to Béarn, and raised money and troops for Condé. After her husband's death, she made Protestantism compulsory in Béarn, which included the cities of Pau, Nérac, Tarbes, Orthez, and Lourdes. Catholic clergymen were dispossessed and were replaced by Huguenot ministers. For 50 years thereafter, no Mass was heard in Béarn. Pope Pius IV excommunicated her and wished to depose her, but Catherine dissuaded him. When Jeanne accepted the offer to bind Valois and Bourbon in marriage, she may have remembered this and Catherine's long struggle for peace. Besides, Catherine's sons were sickly. Might they not all die and leave the throne of France to Henry of Navarre? Had not the soothsayer Nostradamus prophesied that the Valois dynasty would end soon? The sickliest of the sons, Charles IX, might have been a lovable youth, except for occasional fits of cruelty and temper that blazed out at times into a passion verging on insanity. Between such storms he was a reed in the wind, seldom having a mind of his own. Perhaps he weakened himself by sensual indulgence. He was married to Elizabeth, daughter of the Emperor Maximilian II, but his illicit and lasting love was for his Huguenot mistress, Marie Touchet. He was sensitive to art, poetry, and music. He loved to recite Ronsard's lyrics, and he wrote in Ronsard's honor verses as pretty as Ronsard's own. We both wear diadems, but I my crown receive as king, you, poet, made your own. Your lyre, which charms with concourse of sweet sounds, subdues the soul, while flesh my empire bounds. It softens hearts, holds loveliness in fee. I can give death, you immortality. When Coligny joined the court at Blois in September 1571, Charles took to him as weakness welcomes strength. Here was a man all the world away from so many who had been pirouetting around the throne. A gentleman, an aristocrat, but quiet and sober, carrying half of France in the power of his word. The young king called the aging commander Mon Père, appointed him commander of the fleet, gave him from the royal purse a grant of 100,000 livres to reimburse him for his losses during the wars. Coligny joined the council and presided over it in the absence of the king. Charles had always been jealous and fearful of Philip II. He resented the dependence of Catholic France upon Spain. Coligny proposed to him that a war with Spain would give France a unifying cause and would rectify that northeastern boundary upon which Spain was encroaching. Now was the time, for William of Orange was leading a revolt of the Netherlands against their Spanish overlord. One good push and Flanders would be French. Charles listened sympathetically. On April 27th he wrote to Count Louis of Nassau, who was leading the Protestant rebellion in Hainaut, that he was determined to employ the powers which God had put into his hands for the deliverance of the Low Countries from the oppression under which they were groaning. Louis and his brother William of Orange offered to surrender Flanders and Artois to France in return for decisive aid against Spain. In the fall of that year, Charles negotiated with the Elector Augustus of Saxony for a defensive alliance of France and Protestant Germany. Catherine condemned Coligny's proposals as fantastically impracticable. Now that she had the peace that France so needed, it would be folly to unleash the hounds of war so soon again. Spain was as bankrupt as France, but she was still the strongest power in Christendom. She had just covered herself with glory in the defeat of the Turks at Lepanto. She would have all Catholic Europe and most of Catholic France to support her if France entered a Protestant league. In such a war, Coligny would be commander-in-chief, and through his influence on the impressionable Charles, he would in effect be king. Catherine would be relegated to Chenonceau, if not to Italy. Henry of Guise and Henry of Anjou, brother of the king, learned with dismay that Charles was allowing Coligny to send Huguenot troops to join Louis of Nassau. Alva, forewarned by his friends at the French court, overwhelmed this force on July 10, 1572. A full meeting of the King's Council heard Coligny defend his proposals for war with Spain from August 6 to 9, 1572. They were unanimously rejected. Coligny persisted. "I have promised on my own account," he said, "my assistance to the Prince of Orange. I hope the King will not take it ill if, by means of my friends and perhaps in person, I fulfill my promise." He said to the Queen Mother, "Madam, the king is today shunning a war which would promise him great advantages. God forbid that there should break out another which he cannot shun." The council broke up in excited resentment of what seemed a threat of another civil war. "Let the Queen beware," warned Marshal de Tavennes, "of the king her son's secret counsels, designs, and sayings. If she do not look out, the Huguenots will have him." Catherine took Charles aside and reproached him for having surrendered his mind to Coligny. If he persisted in the plan for war against Spain, she would ask his leave to withdraw with her other son to Florence. He asked her forgiveness and promised filial obedience, but he remained Coligny's devoted friend. It was in this atmosphere that Jeanne d'Albret came to Blois to prepare for the marriage that was to unite Catholic and Protestant France. She insisted that Cardinal de Bourbon should perform the ceremony not as a priest but as a prince, not in a church but outside it, and that Henry should not accompany his wife into the church to hear Mass. Catherine agreed, though this would raise more trouble with the Pope, who would refuse dispensation for Marguerite to marry the Protestant son of an excommunicated Protestant. Then Jeanne went on to Paris to shop, fell sick of pleurisy, and died on June 9, 1572. The Huguenots suspected that she had been poisoned, but this hypothesis is no longer entertained. Despite his own suspicions and grief, Henry of Navarre came from Blois to Paris in August, accompanied by Coligny and 800 Huguenots. 4,000 armed Huguenots followed them into the capital, partly to see the festivities, partly to protect their young king. Catholic Paris, aroused by this influx and 100 inflammatory sermons, denounced the marriage as a surrender of the government to Protestant force. Nevertheless, the ceremony took place on August 18th, without papal dispensation. Catherine took measures to prevent the post from bringing a papal prohibition. Henry led his wife to the portals of Notre Dame, but did not enter with her. Paris was not yet worth a mass. Provisionally, he lodged with Marguerite in the Louvre. Seldom had Paris seethed with such excitement. Coligny, still pressing for open aid by France to the revolting Netherlands, was believed ready to leave for the front. Some Catholics warned Catherine that Huguenots were planning another attempt to kidnap her and the king. The hammering of anvils throughout the city revealed the hurried forging of weapons. At this juncture, according to her son Henry, Catherine gave her consent to the murder of the admiral. On August 22nd, as Coligny was walking from the Louvre to his house, 2 shots from a window cut off the first finger of his left hand and ripped his arm to the elbow. His companions rushed into the building, but found only a smoking arquebus. The assailant had escaped by the rear. Coligny was carried to his rooms. The king, informed, cried out angrily, "Am I never to have any peace?" He sent his personal physician, the Huguenot Ambroise Paré, to treat the wounds, assigned royal guards to Coligny's house, commanded the Catholics to leave the adjoining premises, and allowed Huguenots to move in. The Queen, the King, and his brother Henry came to comfort the wounded man, and Charles swore the most terrible oath to revenge the attack. Coligny again urged Charles to enter the war for the acquisition of Flanders. Taking him aside, he whispered some secret. As the royal family returned to the Louvre, Catherine insisted that the king reveal the secret. "Very well, then, by the death of God," he answered, "since you will know, this is what the admiral said to me, that all power has gone to pieces in your hands, and that evil for me would come of it." In a state of frenzy, the king shut himself up in his private apartment. Catherine brooded in fearful resentment. Henry of Navarre came to Coligny and discussed measures of defense. Some members of the admiral's retinue wished to go at once and assassinate the Guise leaders. He forbade them. "If ample justice be not done," said the Huguenots, "they would certainly do it themselves." All that day Huguenots moved about the Louvre. One of them told the Queen that if justice were not soon executed, they would take the law into their own hands. Bands of armed Huguenots passed repeatedly by the Hôtel de Lorraine, where the Guises were staying, and shouted threats of death. The Guises appealed to the king for protection and barricaded themselves in their house. Charles, suspecting them of having hired the assassin, arrested several of their servants and menaced the Duke of Guise. Henry and his brother, the Duke of Aumale, asked permission to leave Paris. It was granted. They went as far as the Porte Saint-Antoine, then they turned back and secretly made their way to the Hôtel de Lorraine. On August 23rd, the council met to inquire into the crime. They learned that the house from which the shots had been fired was owned, though not occupied, by the Dowager Duchess of Guise, who had vowed to avenge the murder of her husband, Francis. that the assassin had escaped on a horse taken from the stables of the Guises, that the weapon had belonged to one of the Duke of Anjou's guardsmen. The assassin was never apprehended. According to Anjou's later account, he and Henry of Guise now decided that Coligny and some other Huguenots must be killed. While Catherine and some members of the council were assembled in the Tuileries, Anjou's agent, Bouchavan, rushed in with the announcement that the Huguenots in Coligny's lodgings were planning violent revolt, probably for the next evening. To Catherine's dislike of the admiral, her anger at what seemed to her his seduction of the king from her guidance, her conviction that the policy of war with Spain would be disastrous for France and her dynasty, there was now added the fear that her life was in immediate danger, and that all power might soon pass into the hands of Coligny and his friends. She agreed that the leading Huguenots should be killed. But the consent of the king was desirable, if not necessary, and he was still demanding the prosecution of all concerned in the attack upon Coligny. About 10 o'clock in this evening of August 23rd, the Queen Mother sent Count de Retz to warn Charles of the supposed insurrection. Soon Catherine and her councillors surrounded the young ruler, whose excitement now brought him close to insanity. Catherine assured him that 30,000 Huguenots were planning to seize him on the morrow and carry him off to some Protestant stronghold, where he would be captive and impotent. Had they not twice before attempted such a stroke? If victorious, they would kill her on suspicion of having ordered or allowed the attack upon the admiral. The boy of 23 was told to choose between his mother's life and the lives of 6 Huguenots. If he refused consent, and Catholic Paris should overcome the revolt, he would be set aside as a coward and a fool. He resisted these arguments. He asked why it would not suffice to arrest the Huguenot leaders and try them legally. The councillors answered that it was too late to avert revolt by such action. Catherine threatened to withdraw to Italy and leave him to his fate. Finally, toward midnight, in a fit of nervous breakdown and rage, Charles shouted, "By the death of God, since you choose to kill the admiral, I consent. But then you must kill all the Huguenots in France, so that not one shall be left to reproach me. Kill them all! Kill them all!" Uttering blasphemies, he fled from his councillors and shut himself up in his room. If the conspirators had plotted to kill only a few, they now took advantage of the king's mad order to make the slaughter of the Huguenots as thorough as possible. Catherine insisted on protecting Henry of Navarre. The young Prince of Condé, Henry I, and the Montmorencys were accepted as too noble for slaughter. The surgeon Ambroise Paré was saved by the king, but word was sent out to the district captains of Paris to arm their men and be ready for action at the tolling of church bells at 3 o'clock in the morning, August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day. Carte blanche was given the Guises to execute their long-delayed revenge upon the admiral. Henry of Guise sent word to the officers of the militia that at the tocsin sound their men were to slay every Huguenot they could find. The gates of the city were to be closed to prevent escapes. While it was yet night, Guise himself led 300 soldiers to the building where Coligny lay asleep. Near him were Paré, his physician, Merlin, his secretary, Nicolas, his servant. They were awakened by the clatter of soldiers approaching. They heard shots and cries. Coligny's guards were being killed. A friend burst into the room crying, "We are lost." The admiral replied, "I have long been prepared for death. Save yourselves. I do not wish those who hold you dear to be able to reproach me with your death. I commend my soul to the mercy of God." They fled. Guise's soldiers broke in the door. They found Coligny kneeling in prayer. A soldier ran him through and slashed his face. Others stabbed him. Still alive, he was tossed through the window to fall upon the pavement below at Guise's feet. After making sure that Coligny was dead, the Duke ordered his men to scatter through Paris and spread the word, "Tuez, tuez, kill, kill, the king commands it." The head of the admiral was severed from his body and sent to the Louvre, some said to Rome. The body was given up to the multitude, which mangled it ferociously, cut off the hands and the genitals to offer them for sale, and strung up the rest by the heels. Meanwhile, the Queen, feeling some remorse or fear, sent orders to the Guises to halt the massacre. They answered that it was too late. Coligny being dead, the Huguenots must be killed, or they would surely revolt. Catherine yielded and ordered the tocsin to be rung. There followed such slaughter as cities have seldom known, even in the frenzy of war. The populace rejoiced at the freedom given to its suppressed impulses to strike, to inflict pain, and to kill. It hunted out and slew from 2,000 to 5,000 Huguenots and others. Murders previously meditated could now be perpetrated with impunity. Harassed or ambitious wives or husbands took the opportunity to rid themselves of unwanted mates. Merchants were slain by competitors. Relatives too slow to die were pointed out as Huguenots by prospective heirs. Ramus the philosopher was killed at the urging of a jealous professor. Every house suspected of harboring Huguenots was invaded and searched. Huguenots and their children were dragged into the streets and slain. Embryos were torn from dead mothers and smashed. Soon corpses littered the pavement. Urchins played games on them. The Catholic Swiss guards of the king entered the fray and slew indiscriminately out of pure joy of slaughter. The Duke de la Rochefoucauld, who had played tennis with the king the day before, was killed by masked men who he supposed had come to invite him to some royal frolic. Huguenot nobles and officers who had been lodged in the Louvre as the King of Navarre's retinue were called into the courtyard and were shot one by one as they came. Henry himself, rising at dawn, went off to play tennis. Charles sent for him and Condé and gave them a choice of the Mass or death. Condé chose death, but was saved by the Queen. Navarre promised compliance and was allowed to live. His bride, Marguerite, sleeping fretfully, was awakened by a wounded Huguenot who rushed into her room and her bed. She persuaded his pursuers to spare him. "As I write," reported the Spanish ambassador, "they are killing them all. They are stripping them naked, sparing not even the children. Blessed be God." Now that the law itself had become lawless, pillage ran free, and the king was informed that members of his court had joined in the sack of the capital. Toward midday, some horrified citizens pleaded with him to have the slaughter stopped, and a party of the town police offered to help restore order. He issued commands to halt the massacre. He bade the police imprison Protestants for their own protection. Some of these he saved, others at his bidding were drowned in the Seine. For a while the carnage abated. But on Monday the 25th the hawthorn blossomed, quite out of season, in the Cemetery of the Innocents. The clergy hailed this as a miracle. The church bells of Paris rang out to acclaim it. The populace mistook the clangor as a call to renew the slaughter. Murder took on new life. On the 26th the king went in state with his court through the streets, still littered with corpses, to the Palace of Justice, and proudly certified to the Parlement of Paris that he had ordered the massacre. The president replied with a long address of congratulation. Parlement voted that Coligny's heirs should be outlawed, his home at Châtillon demolished, the remainder of his property confiscated by the Duke of Anjou. On the 28th, the king, the queen mother, and the court visited several churches in a religious festival of thanksgiving for the redemption of France from heresy and the escape of the royal family from death. The provinces imitated Paris in their amateur way. Inspired by news from the capital, Lyon, Dijon, Orléans, Blois, Tours, Troyes, Meaux, Bourges, Angers, Rouen, Toulouse, staged ecstatic massacres between August 24th and 26th. Jacques de Thou reckoned 800 victims at Lyon, 1,000 at Orléans. The king encouraged and then discouraged these holocausts. On the 26th he sent verbal instructions to provincial governors to kill all leading Huguenots. On the 27th he sent them written orders to protect peaceful and law-abiding Protestants. At the same time he wrote his agent at Brussels to invite the Duke of Alva's cooperation. "The Duke has many of my rebellious subjects in his hands, and the means of taking Mons and punishing those besieged in it. If he answers you that this is tacitly to require him to kill these prisoners and to cut to pieces those in Mons, you are to say that this is what he must do." Alva rejected the invitation. When he captured Mons, he allowed the French garrison to depart unharmed. Privately, he scorned the massacre of St. Bartholomew as a base means of waging war. Publicly, he ordered a celebration of the massacre as a triumph for the only true Christianity. Some provincial governors kept their populace under civilized control. There were no killings in Champagne, Picardy, or Brittany, and few in Auvergne, Languedoc, Burgundy, or Dauphiné. At Lyon, many Catholics denounced the slaughter, and the soldiers refused to take part in it. At Vienne, the bishop took the Protestants under his protection, and Catholic families gave hiding to endangered Huguenots. But at Troyes and Orléans, the bishops gave full rein to the massacre. At Bordeaux, a Jesuit announced that the Archangel Michael had ordered the killings, and he condemned the tardiness of the magistrates in ordering the executions. Probably the provinces contributed 5,000 victims, and Paris some 2,000, but estimates of the total ranged from 5,000 to 30,000. Catholics generally condoned the massacre as an explosion of resentment and revenge after years of Huguenot persecution of Catholics. Philip II laughed beyond his dour wont when he heard the news. Now there would be no danger of France's interfering in the Netherlands. The papal nuncio at Paris wrote to Rome, "I congratulate His Holiness from the depths of my heart that it has pleased the Divine Majesty, at the beginning of his pontificate, to direct the affairs of this kingdom so felicitously and so honorably, and to have so protected the King and Queen Mother that they would destroy this pestiferous root with such prudence, and at such an opportune moment when all their rebels were locked in the cage." When the tidings reached Rome, the Cardinal of Lorraine, out of ungovernable happiness, gave the bearer 1,000 crowns. Soon all Rome was illuminated. Salvos were fired from the Castel Sant'Angelo. Bells rang joyously. Gregory XIII and his cardinals attended a solemn mass of thanksgiving to God for this signal favor shown to Christian people, which had saved France and the Holy See from great peril. The Pope ordered a special medal struck to commemorate Huguenotorum Strages, the defeat or slaughter of the Huguenots, and he engaged Vasari to paint in the Sala Regia of the Vatican a picture of the massacre, bearing the words Pontifex Colignii necem probat. The Pope approves the killing of Coligny. Protestant Europe branded the massacres as dastardly barbarism. William of Orange told the French envoy that Charles IX would never be able to wash the blood from his hands. In England, Elizabeth was beset with demands for revenge, and bishops advised her that the only way to quiet the public fury was to put to death at once all Catholics who were in prison for having refused to take the oath of allegiance. At least the Queen of Scots should be executed at once. Elizabeth kept her head. She robed herself in deep mourning to receive the French ambassador and met with visible unbelief his protestations that the massacre had been necessitated by imminent Huguenot conspiracy. But she continued to play France against Spain and to dally with Alençon's suit for her hand, and in November she consented to act as godmother to the daughter of Charles IX. Catherine emerged from the shambles cheerful and refreshed. The king was now again her vassal, and the Huguenot problem seemed solved. She was mistaken. Though many French Protestants had accepted conversion as an alternative to death, these recantations proved transitory. Within 2 months of the massacre, the Huguenots opened the Fourth Religious War. La Rochelle and several other towns closed their gates to royalist troops and successfully resisted siege. On July 6, 1573, Charles signed the Peace of La Rochelle, guaranteeing the Huguenots religious liberty. Politically, the massacre had accomplished nothing. And now the Huguenot intellectuals, who had heretofore professed loyalty to the king, turned in horror from Charles IX and questioned not only the divine right of kings, but the institution of monarchy itself. François Hautement, a Huguenot jurist, had fled to Switzerland after the massacre. A year later he published a passionate attack upon Charles, De Furoribus Gallicis. The crimes of that king had released his people from their oath of loyalty. He was a felon and should be deposed. Before the year was out, Hautement sent forth from Geneva his Franco-Gallia, the first modern attempt at constitutional history. The Gallo-French monarchy, he argued, had been elective. The king had been, till Louis XI, subject to a national assembly of one kind or another. The now abject parlements and the long-neglected States General were the weakened remnants of that elective power, and that power had been delegated to these bodies by the people. To the people alone belongs the right to elect and depose kings. He demanded the periodic assembly of the States General. This body alone should have the authority to issue laws and make war or peace, to appoint to major offices, to regulate the succession, and to depose bad kings. Here already was the thunder of 1789. Life itself soon deposed Charles IX. Good and evil in him had struggled to the point where a constitution congenitally botched had broken down from the strain. Sometimes he gloated over the hardihood and the extremity of his crime. At other times he accused himself of having consented to the massacre, and the cries of butchered Huguenots kept ringing in his ears, murdering sleep. He began to reproach his mother. "Who but you is the cause of all this? God's blood, you are the cause of it all." She complained that she had a lunatic for a son. He became melancholy and somber, thin and pale. He had always tended to tuberculosis. Now his resistance weakened. It destroyed him. By 1574 he was spitting blood. In the spring his hemorrhages grew more violent, and he again had visions of his victims. "What bloodshed, what murders!" he cried to his nurse. "What evil counsel have I followed? Oh, my God, forgive me! I am lost." On his dying day, May 30th, 1574, he called for Henry of Navarre, whom he embraced affectionately. "Brother," he said, "you are losing a good friend. Had I believed all that I was told, you would not be alive. But I always loved you. I trust in you alone to look after my wife and daughter. Pray God for me. Farewell." Soon afterward he died. He was not yet 24. Chapter 14. Henry IV, 1553 to 1610. 1. Love and Marriage. Henry's grandmother was Marguerite of Angoulême, Valois, and Navarre, the lovable, sensitive, pious sister of the amorous, gallant, dashing Francis I. His mother was the rebellious, unmanageable, heretical Jeanne d'Albret. His father, Antoine de Bourbon, a descendant of St. Louis, was handsome, brave, debonair, vain, with a tendency to fluctuate from creed to creed. When Henry struggled into the world, on December 14, 1553, at Pau, in Béarn, he may have carried in him all these ancestral qualities except piety. His happy grandfather, sure that it would be a fine omen, persuaded Jeanne in her pains to sing a song to the Virgin, and as a baptism into Béarn, he rubbed the lips of the babe with garlic and made him drink wine. The hero sucked 8 nurses dry. He did not relish education. He disliked writing, fled from grammar, and learned to write a fascinating style. He read Plutarch as his Bible of heroism. He was brought up almost wholly out of doors, majored in running, romping, wrestling, riding, pummeling, ate black bread, cheese, and onions, enjoyed summer and winter with a relish that laughed pessimism out of face. He was reared as a Huguenot, but he never allowed religion to hobble life. Summoned at the age of 9 to live at the court and learn its graces and morals, he readily adopted Catholicism. Returning to Béarn at 13, he resumed the Huguenot faith as if he were adjusting his clothes to the climate. With greater facility he passed from love to love. La Petite Tignonville, Mademoiselle de Montagu, Arnaudine, La Garce, or the Wench, Catherine de Luc, and de Camfort. He moulted creeds and mistresses without distressing his conscience or shifting his aim. His aim was to be King of France. At 19, his father having died, Henry became King of Navarre, but that was only a teasing taste of royalty. When he went to Paris to marry Marguerite of Valois, he was received as next only to the Duke of Anjou and the Duke of Alençon in line for the throne. When massacre followed on marriage, he kept and saved his head by timely apostasy. His bride, Margot, was the most fascinating and accommodating woman in France. No one questioned her beauty. Ronsard sang it. Brantôme intoned ecstasies about her fine cosmetic skin, her waving hair or varied wigs, her eyes darting humor, anger, or deviltry, her figure shapely as a courtesan's and stately as a queen's, her lively feet leading the dances of the court, her contagion of vivacity in an age of strife and gloom. All these magnets drew a dozen lovers to her lair, and gossip credited her with tactful, even incestuous capitulations. Henry could hardly complain, having himself a roving eye, but when Margot, who had married him against her will, resumed her fluctuations after a brief obeisance to monogamy, he began to wonder who would be the father of his children. He took a mistress, he fell ill, Margot generously nursed him, though she ascribed his disorder to excess with women. But soon their mutual suspicion so estranged them that she wrote, "We neither slept nor spoke with each other any more." For 3 years he remained unwillingly at the court. One night in 1575, while hunting, he galloped out of bounds. Then he fled in disguise across France, found his way through a dozen perils to Nérac, and governed Béarn and Guienne with justice and wit. He abandoned Catholicism, restored the Protestants to power in Béarn, and protected them in Guienne. 3 years later, Margot joined him, and the young king, when not following the hunt or fighting Catholics, helped her to make the festivities of her little court outface their infidelities. In 1582, tired of helping his mistresses in their confinements, she returned to Paris. But there her escapades were so flagrant that her brother, Henry III, bade her hurry back to her husband. After 2 years more in Béarn, she retired to Agen. The 2 kings, now 2 Henrys, agreed to her practical imprisonment in the Chateau d'Usson, and allowed her a fair pension from 1587 to 1605. She turned her prison into a salon, entertained poets, artists, scholars, and lovers, and composed her gossipy memoirs. Richelieu commended her style, Montaigne dedicated essays to her, preachers praised her charity. After substantial inducements, she consented to an annulment of her marriage and was allowed to return to Paris and the court in 1605. There she resumed her romances and her salon, became fat and penitent, took Vincent de Paul as her chaplain, founded a convent, and died in peace and piety in 1615 at the age of 62. So ended, said a contemporary, Marguerite, sole remains of the race of the Valois, a princess full of good intentions who did no harm to anyone but herself. 2. Henry III, 1574 to 1589. The Duke of Anjou, after a brief tenure of the Polish throne, returned, aged 24, to be Henry III, the last Valois king of France. An anonymous portrait in the Louvre shows him tall, lank, pale, wistful, a man of good will confused by bad heredity. He was physically weak, emotionally unstable, easily fatigued. He had to avoid riding and hunting, and a few minutes of active love left him bedded for days. His skin itched incurably, his head and stomach ached, his ear ran. Before he was 36, his hair was white and his teeth were gone. His apparent haughtiness was really diffidence, his cruelty was fear. Normally he was gentle and cautious. Unfortunately, he had a passion for feminine raiment. He appeared at a ball in a low-necked dress with a circlet of pearls around his throat. He wore jewels in his ears and bracelets on his arms. He gathered about him a dozen mignons, youths who frizzed their long hair, painted their faces, adorned themselves with fancy garb, and sprinkled themselves with perfumes that scented their trail. With these uncertain men he would on occasion, disguised as a woman, romp through the streets at night, playing pranks upon the citizens. In a country nearing bankruptcy and anarchy, he emptied the treasury upon his male favorites, spending 11 million francs on the wedding of one, and doubling the price of judgeships to buy a marriage gift for another. Some of his people's money he spent to good purpose, building the Pont Neuf, improving the Louvre, and raising parts of Paris out of squalor into architecture and cleanliness. He supported literature and the theater. He labored fretfully at administration. To square all his accounts, he made pilgrimages on foot to Chartres and Cléry. In Paris, he walked from church to church, fingering large rosaries, zealously accumulating paternosters and Ave Marias. He marched in the ghostly nocturnal processions of the blue penitents, his body enclosed in a sack with holes for feet and eyes. He had no children. His mother, who had brought the seeds of degeneracy to him from diseased parents, looked with sorrow on the decadence and the imminent extinction of her stock. The political situation was confused beyond Henry's understanding. He was not made for war, and Catherine, aging, longed for peace. But the Huguenots, desperate yet unsubdued, were still in revolt. His brother, the Duke of Alençon, was flirting with a Protestant queen in England, with Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, and with Henry of Navarre in Béarn. A minority of Catholic leaders, called politique by their critics, took up the ideas of L'Hôpital, who had died in grief in 1573, proposed mutual toleration between the warring faiths, and defended the idea, so unpopular in both camps, that a nation could survive without unity of religious belief. If, they argued, the popes forbade such a compromise, France should sever its religious bonds with Rome. Frightened by the cooperation of politique and Huguenots, and by the inroads of German troops coming to reinforce the Protestants, Henry ended in 1576 the Fifth Religious War by signing the Peace of Monsieur at Beaulieu and issuing an Edict of Pacification, the Edict of Beaulieu, which gave the Huguenots full freedom of worship everywhere in France, made them eligible to all offices, and allowed them 8 cities in which they were to have complete political and military dominance. Most French Catholics, and above all the ardently orthodox populace of Paris, were shocked by these concessions to a party supposedly destroyed. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now. The Story of Civilization, Volume 7, The Age of Reason Begins, by Will and Ariel Durant. Part 2, continued. Cassette 2, Side 2. Most French Catholics, and above all the ardently orthodox populace of Paris, were shocked by these concessions to a party supposedly destroyed. In 1562, the Cardinal of Lorraine had proposed a Ligue Sainte, whose members should swear to defend the Church by whatever means and at whatever cost. Henry of Guise had organized such a band in Champagne in 1568. Now similar associations were formed in many provinces. In 1576, the Duke openly proclaimed the Holy League and took the field with a vow to crush the Huguenots once and for all. We must not follow the trajectories of the 6th, 7th, and 8th religious wars, except as they affected the flow of ideas or the character of France. Now again philosophy entered the fray. In 1579, an unidentified author, perhaps Philippe Duplessis Mornay, one of Navarre's counselors, sent out from Basel a stirring pronunciamento entitled Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, a vindication of public rights against tyrants. It was written in Latin, but was soon translated into vernaculars. Its influence lasted for a century. It was used by the Huguenots in France, by the Dutch against Philip, by the Puritans against Charles I, by the Whigs to justify the dethroning of James II. The old theory of an implicit social contract between a nation and its ruler here took definite form. We shall see it again in Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Government is, first of all, a covenant between God, the people, and the king to uphold and obey the true religion, in this case Protestantism. Any king failing to do this may be deposed. Secondly, government is a pact between king and people, the one to rule justly, the other to obey peaceably. King and people alike are subject to natural law, that is, a law of reason and natural justice, conformable to the divine moral code and superior to all positive or man-made law. The function of the king is to maintain the law, positive, natural, and divine. He is the instrument, not the dictator of the law. Subjects considered in a body ought to be esteemed absolute lords and owners of the kingdom. But who shall determine whether the king is a tyrant? Not the people as a multitude, that monster with countless heads. Rather let the magistrates decide, or some such assembly as the States General of France. It will not do for each private individual to follow his own conscience. He would mistake his desires for his conscience, and chaos would ensue. But if the magistrate summons him to armed rebellion, he must obey the call. If, however, the tyrant is a usurper, he may be justly killed by anyone. The conflict of force and ideas was sharpened when the Duke of Alençon died in 1584 and Henry III recognized Henry of Navarre as heir presumptive to the throne. Overnight, the Huguenots ceased to talk of tyranny and deposition and became ardent supporters of legitimacy, expecting the fragile Valois king to collapse soon and yield France to their Bourbon Protestant. The Vindiciae, so recently a Huguenot manifesto, was frowned upon, and Hautmont himself proclaimed that resistance to Henry of Navarre was a sin. But most of France shuddered at the thought of a Huguenot king. How could a Protestant be anointed at Rheims by the Church? And could anyone without such unction ever be a rightful monarch of France? The Orthodox clergy, led by fervent Jesuits, denounced the succession and called all Catholics to the League. Henry III, swept away by the tide, joined the League and ordered all Huguenots to accept Catholicism or leave France. Henry of Navarre appealed to Europe to recognize the justice of his cause, but Pope Sixtus V excommunicated him and declared that as a persistent heretic he could not inherit the throne. Charles, Cardinal de Bourbon, now declared himself heir presumptive. Catherine again tried for peace, offering to support Navarre if he would renounce Protestantism. He refused. He took the field with an army partly Catholic, captured half a dozen cities in as many months, and defeated at Coutras a League army twice as large as his own. This in 1587. The Huguenots, numbering about a twelfth of the population, now held half the major towns of France. But Paris was the heart of France, and Paris was passionately for the League. Dissatisfied with Henry III's half-hearted support, the League set up in the capital a revolutionary government composed of representatives from the 16 wards. The 16 negotiated with Spain for a Spanish invasion of England and France, and planned to seize the person of the king. Henry sent for Swiss guards. The 16 called upon the Duke of Guise to take control of Paris. The king forbade it, The Duke came and was hailed by the populace as head of the Catholic cause in France. Henry III, humiliated and vowing vengeance, fled to Chartres. Then, again losing his nerve, he disowned Henry of Navarre, appointed Henry of Guise commander-in-chief of the royal armies, and summoned the States General to meet at Blois. When the delegates assembled, the king noted with anger the almost royal honors paid to Guise. In a day of frenzied resolution, he persuaded some of his aides to kill the Duke. He invited him to a private conference. As the young noble approached the king's room, 9 assailants stabbed him to death, and the king, opening a door, gazed in excited satisfaction upon his accomplished aim. This on December 24, 1588. He ordered the imprisonment of the League leaders and the death of the Duke's brother, the Cardinal of Guise. In pride and terror he reported his vicarious exploits to his mother. She wrung her hands in despair. "You have ruined the kingdom," she told him. 12 days later she died, aged 69, worn out with responsibilities, anxieties, intrigues, and probably remorse. Hardly anyone paused to mourn her. She was buried in a common grave at Blois, for when a proposal was made to let her remains occupy the tomb she had prepared in Saint-Denis, the 16 announced that if her body were brought to Paris, they would throw it into the Seine. Half of France denounced Henry III as a murderer. Students paraded the streets demanding his dethronement. The theologians of the Sorbonne, supported by the Pope, absolved the people from allegiance to the king, and priests called for armed resistance to him everywhere. Supporters of the king were arrested. Men and women crowded the churches for fear of being taken as royalists. The pamphleteers of the League took over the political ideology of the Huguenots. The people were declared sovereign, with the right through the Parlement or the magistrates to depose a tyrant. Any future king should be subject to constitutional limitations, and his prime duty should be to enforce the true religion, in this case Catholicism. Henry III, now at Tours with some nobles and soldiers, found himself between two terrors. The army of the League under the Duke of Mayenne was advancing upon him from the north. The army of Navarre, taking town after town, was advancing from the south. One or the other force must capture him. Henry the Huguenot seized his opportunity. He sent to Plessis-Mornay to offer the king alliance, protection, and support. At Plessis-les-Tours, the two Henrys met and pledged mutual fidelity, this on April 30th, 1589. Together their armies defeated Mayenne and marched upon Paris. In the frenzied capital, a Dominican monk, Jacques Clément, listened fervently to denunciations of Henry III as an assassin. He was assured that a great deed in a divine cause would clear away all the guilt of his sins, and the grief and beauty of Catherine, Duchess of Montpensier, sister of the slain Guises, agitated him. He bought a dagger, found his way into the royal camp, stabbed the king in the stomach, was killed by the guards, and died in the confidence of paradise. Henry of Valois died on the morrow, on August 2, 1589, beseeching his followers to cleave to his cousin of Navarre. Chaos swept through the besieging army. Much of it melted away. The proposed attack on Paris was postponed. Within the city, the joy of the League and its followers reached delirium. Some churches placed the monk's picture on the altar. Devotees hailed the assassination as the noblest act of God since the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Clément's mother was brought from the provinces, preached in the churches, and was hailed with a sacred chant, "Blessed be the womb that bore thee, and the paps that gave thee suck." 3. The Road to Paris, 1589 to 1594. Henry of Navarre was at the crisis of his life. Suddenly he was, in law and by tradition, King of France, but almost as suddenly half his troops deserted him. The nobles who had clung to Henry III rode off to their estates. Most of the Catholics in his army disappeared. 2/3 of France rejected forcibly the notion of a Protestant king. The politique had for the time been silenced by the two assassinations. The Parlement of Paris recognized Cardinal de Bourbon as King of France. Philip of Spain pledged to the League the gold of the Americas to keep France Catholic. Meanwhile, not quite to Philip's chagrin, the disruption of French production and trade had brought the country to such desolation that no comfort was left it but the consuming ecstasy of hate. It was out of the question for Navarre to attack a city so overwhelmingly hostile as Paris, with an army so disorganized and reduced. Cautiously, and with a generalship impeded more by his mistresses than by the enemy, he withdrew his forces northward to receive help from England, and Mayenne followed as rapidly as his corpulence would permit. At Arques, just south of Dieppe, the two armies met, Henry with 7,000 men, Mayenne with 23,000. on September 21st, 1589. We may gather the result from Henry's message to his comrade at arms. "Hang yourself, brave Crillon. We have fought at Arques, and you were not there." The victory heartened Henry's secret supporters everywhere. Several towns opened their gates to him cheerfully. The Republic of Venice recognized him as king. Elizabeth, as anxious as Venice to keep Spain from dominating France, sent him 4,000 troops, 22,000 pounds in gold, 70,000 pounds of gunpowder, and cargoes of shoes, food, wine, and beer. Philip retaliated by sending a detachment from Flanders to Mayenne. The reinforced armies fought at Ivry on the Eure, March 14, 1590. Henry stuck a white plume, hardly to be termed a white feather, in his helmet, and told his soldiers, "If the heat of battle disperse you for a while, rally under those pear trees you see up yonder to my right, and if you lose your standards, do not lose sight of my white plume. You will always find it in the path of honor, and, I hope, of victory, too." As usual, he fought in the fore of the fray. His right arm was swollen and his sword beaten out of shape with the blows they gave. His reputation for mercy served him well, for thousands of unpaid Swiss in Mayenne's service surrendered. Henry's victory left the League without an army. Almost unhindered, he advanced to besiege Paris again. From May to September 1590, his hungry and penniless soldiers camped around the capital, eager to assault and plunder it, but checked by Henry's refusal to sanction a slaughter that might have been worse than the St. Bartholomew. After a month of siege, the Parisians were eating horses, cats, dogs, and grass. Henry relented and let provisions enter the city. The Duke of Parma, Philip's governor in the Netherlands, came to the relief of Paris with a well-equipped army of Spanish veterans. Henry, outmaneuvered, retreated to Rouen. Parma followed him in a duel of strategy. Sickness disabled the Duke, and Henry's army once more sat down before the capital. Now he faced the decisive question. Could he, as a Protestant, win and keep the throne of a country 90% Catholic? Even his army was predominantly Catholic. Doubtless it was no small item in his thoughts that he was running out of funds and could no longer pay his troops. He called in his aides and confessed that he was thinking of conversion to Catholicism. Some approved the plan as the only road to peace. Some condemned it as a cruel and scandalous desertion of Huguenots who had given him blood and money in the hope of having a Protestant king. To these Henry replied, "If I were to follow your advice, in a little while there would be neither king nor kingdom in France. I wish to give peace to my subjects and rest to my soul. Take counsel among you as to what you need for your security. I shall always be ready to satisfy you." He added, "Perhaps between the two religions the difference is great only through the animosity of those who preach it. Some day, by my authority, I shall try to arrange all that." And he defined his own essential faith. "Those who unswervingly follow their conscience are of my religion, and I am of the religion of all who are brave and good." Duplessis Mornay, Agrippa d'Aubigny, and many other Protestant leaders abandoned the king, but Henry's most trusted adviser, the Duke of Sully, while himself remaining staunchly Protestant, agreed with his master's decision. Paris is well worth a mass. On May 18, 1593, Henry sent word to the Pope and the Paris hierarchy that he desired instruction in the Catholic faith. Gregory XIV had renewed his excommunication, but the French hierarchy, never obsequious to Rome, prepared to groom the new penitent to be a pious king. He was no easy pupil. He would give no pledge to make war against heresy, and refused to sign or believe rubbish which he was quite sure that the majority of them did not believe themselves. He graciously agreed to the doctrine of purgatory because it is the best part of your revenues. On July 25th he wrote to his current mistress, "I'm going to make the perilous leap." He went to the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, confessed, received absolution, and heard Mass. Thousands of voices in both camps denounced him as a hypocrite. The Jesuits repudiated his conversion, and the League leaders continued to resist. But the deaths of the Duke of Parma and the Cardinal de Bourbon had weakened the League, and the 16 had lost standing with French patriots by supporting Philip's plan to have his daughter made Queen of France. Many of the nobility inclined to Henry as a general who could keep Philip in check, and as a humane ruler who could restore health to a land disordered to the verge of dismemberment. A clever periodical, Satire Minipé, 1593 to 1594, voiced the sentiments of the politique and the bourgeoisie, ridiculed with wit and irony the Jesuits and the League, and declared, "There is no peace so unjust that it is not worth more than the most just war." Even fanatical Paris was crying for peace. Minor hostilities continued for 8 months more, but on March 22, 1594, Henry marched into Paris, and hardly a man hindered him. Such crowds acclaimed him that when he wished to enter Notre Dame, he had to be lifted over the heads of the multitude. Established as king in the same Louvre where, 22 years before, he had been a prisoner and near death, he surrendered himself to joy, and issued in his buoyant way an amnesty to all, even to the Guises and the 16. Some enemies he brought over by ready forgiveness and gallant courtesy. Some he bribed with borrowed funds. Not all were won over. At Lyons, Pierre Barrière bought a knife, had it sharpened, and started out for Paris, proclaiming his intent to assassinate the king. He was arrested at Melun and summarily strangled. "Alas," said Henry, "if I had known it, I would have pardoned him." Pope Clement VIII sent the king absolution, but the Jesuits continued to preach against him. On December 27th, Jean Châtel, aged 19, struck at the king with a dagger, but inflicted only a cut lip and a broken tooth. Again Henry proposed to pardon the fanatic, but the authorities subjected Châtel to all the tortures required by the law against regicides. He proudly admitted his desire to kill the king as a dangerous heretic, and professed his readiness to make another attempt for his own salvation's sake. He confessed that he was a pupil of the Jesuits, but would not further implicate them in his enterprise. The Spanish Jesuit, Juan de Mariana, whom we shall meet again, was quoted as having approved the assassination of bad kings, of Henry III especially, and the French Jesuit, Jean Guignard, was found to have written that Henry IV should have been killed in the massacre of St. Bartholomew, and that he ought now to be got rid of at any price and in any way whatsoever. Early in 1595, the Parlement of Paris, on petition of the secular clergy of the Sorbonne, ordered the Jesuits to leave France. 4. The Creative King, 1594 to 1610. Henry found the task of reconstruction more arduous than the conquest of power. 32 years of religious wars had left France almost as devastated and chaotic as after the 100 Years' War the century before. The French merchant marine had practically vanished from the seas. 300,000 homes had been destroyed. Hatred had declared a moratorium on morals and had poisoned France with the lust for revenge. Demobilized soldiers harried the roads and villages with robbery and murder. The nobles plotted to exact, as the price of their loyalty, a return to feudal seigneurial sovereignties. The provinces, long left to their own resources, were dividing France into autonomous states, and the Huguenots were clamoring for political independence as well as religious liberty. The League still had a hostile army in the field. Henry brought its leader, Mayenne, to truce, and finally to peace in January 1596. The terms having been signed, Henry walked the fat duke into panting exhaustion, and then assured him that this was the only revenge he would take. When one of his own generals, Charles de Gontaut, Duke of Biron, led a conspiracy against him, Henry offered him pardon for a confession. This being refused, Henry had him tried, convicted, and beheaded in 1602. By this time, France realized that Navarre was king. The people of France, tired of anarchy, allowed him, the business classes begged him, to make the new Bourbon monarchy absolute. Royal absolutism, which was the cause of civil war in England, was the effect of civil war in France. Since the first necessity of government is money, Henry collected taxes. The existing Council of Finance emitted more than the normal odor of corruption. Henry made the fearless Sully superintendent of finance, and gave him a free hand to clear the air and the road between taxes paid and those received. Maximilien de Bethune, Baron of Rosny, Duke of Sully, had been Henry's faithful friend for a quarter of a century, had fought at his side for 14 years. Now, in 1597, still only 37, he attacked embezzlers and incompetents with such uncompromising energy that he became the most valuable and unpopular member of the Royal Council. His portrait, by Dumonstier, hangs in the Louvre. Large head, massive brow, sharp, suspicious eyes. Here was the practical genius needed to check the romantic spirit of a king who was too busy as Casanova to be quite Charlemagne. Sully made himself the watchdog of the administration. As superintendent of finance, highways, communications, public buildings, fortifications, and artillery, as governor of the Bastille and surveyor general of Paris, he was everywhere, supervised everything, insisted on efficiency, economy, and integrity. He worked through every waking hour, lived austerely in a simple room bearing pictures of Luther and Calvin on the walls. He guarded the interests of his fellow Huguenots. He stabilized the currency, reorganized and disciplined the bureaucracy, and forced thieving officials to disgorge. He reclaimed for the state all property and revenues that had been appropriated by individuals during the wars. He compelled 40,000 tax dodgers to pay their taxes. He had found the national treasury in debt by 296 million livres. He paid off these obligations, balanced the budget, and gathered a surplus of 13 million livres. He protected and encouraged all phases of economic life, built roads and bridges, planned the great canals that were to join the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the Seine and the Loire. He declared all navigable rivers to be part of the royal domain, forbade obstructions in them, and renewed the flow of goods through the land. With the help of such wisely chosen ministers, Henry proceeded to recreate France. He restored to the courts and the Parlement their lawful functions and authority. And if he allowed the bureaucratic officials for a price to transmit their positions to their sons, it was not merely to raise money, but to ensure stability of administration and to raise up the middle classes, in particular the legal fraternity or noblesse de la robe, as offsets and balances to the hostile aristocracy. Usually too eager for life and work to read a book, the king studied carefully Olivier de Serres' Les Théâtres d'Agriculture from 1600, which suggested more scientific methods of farming. He established these improvements on the crown lands as examples and prods to the vegetative peasantry. He longed, as he said, to see la poule au pot, a chicken in every pot on Sunday. He forbade nobles to ride over vineyards or cornfields on their hunts. He suppressed the ravages of troops on peasant lands. He cancelled 20 million livres of tax arrears owed by the peasants, perhaps because he knew he could never collect them, and lowered the poll tax from 20 to 14 million livres. Anticipating Colbert, he protected existing industries with tariffs and introduced new industries like the making of fine pottery and glass and the culture of silk. He planted mulberry trees in the gardens of the Tuileries and Fontainebleau and required that 10,000 should be planted in every diocese. He helped and enlarged the tapestry works of the Gobelins. To evade the restrictive policies of the masters in the guilds, he reorganized French industry on a corporative basis. Employers and employees united in each craft and subject to regulation by the state. Poverty continued, partly because of war, pestilence, and taxes, partly because the natural inequality of ability amid the general equality of greed ensures in each generation that the majority of goods will be absorbed by a minority of men. The king himself lived economically, extravagant only with his mistresses. To occupy the unemployed and clear the countryside of idle and voracious veterans, he financed a large variety of public works. Streets were broadened and paved, canals were dug, trees were planted along the highways, parks and squares, like the Place Royale, now the Place des Vosges, and the Place Dauphine, were opened to let Paris breathe. For the disabled destitute, the king founded the Hôpital de la Charité. Not all these reforms matured before his sudden death, but by the end of his reign the country was enjoying such prosperity as it had not known since Francis I. Above all, Henry ended the religious wars and taught Catholics and Protestants to live in peace, not in amity, for no thoroughgoing Catholic would admit the right of a Huguenot to exist, and no fervent Huguenot could view the Catholic worship as anything but pagan idolatry. Taking his life in his hands, Henry issued on April 13, 1598, the historic Edict of Nantes, authorizing the full exercise of the Protestant faith and freedom of the Protestant press in all of the 800 towns of France except 17, in which, as in Paris, Catholicism was overwhelmingly predominant. The eligibility of Huguenots to public offices was confirmed. 2 were already in the Council of State, and the Huguenot Turenne was to be a Marshal of France. The government was to pay the salaries of Protestant ministers and of the rectors of Protestant schools. Protestant children were to be admitted on an equality with Catholics to all schools, colleges, universities, and hospitals. Towns already controlled by the Huguenots, such as La Rochelle, Montpellier, and Montauban, were to remain so, and their garrisons and forts were to be maintained by the state. The religious liberty so granted was still imperfect. It included only Catholics and Protestants, but it constituted the most advanced religious toleration in Europe. It took a man of doubtful faith to turn his most Christian majesty into a Christian. Catholics throughout France cried out against the edict as a betrayal of Henry's promise to support their creed. Pope Clement VIII condemned it as the most accursed that can be imagined, whereby liberty of conscience is granted to everybody, which is the worst thing in the world. Catholic writers proclaimed anew that a heretic king might justly be deposed or slain, and Protestant authors like Hautmont, who under Henry III had defended popular sovereignty, now praised the virtues of absolutism in a Protestant king. The Parliament of Paris long refused to give the edict that official registration without which, according to custom, no royal decree could become accepted law. Henry summoned the members and explained that what he had done was indispensable to peace and the reconstruction of France. The Parliament yielded, and it received 6 Huguenots into its membership. Perhaps to quiet the Catholic opposition and placate the Pope, Henry allowed the Jesuits to return to France in 1603. Sully argued stoutly against the move. The Jesuits, he urged, were men of genius, but full of cunning and artifice. They were committed to the cause of the Habsburgs, therefore of France's enemies, Spain and Austria. They were pledged and inclined to unconditionally obey the Pope, who was a geographical prisoner and financial dependent of the Habsburgs. They would sooner or later dictate Henry's policies, or, failing therein, they would persuade some fanatic to take away your life by poison or other means. Henry replied that the support of the Jesuits would be a great help to him in unifying France, and their continued exile and hostility would be more dangerous to his life and policies than their re-entry into France. He accepted the Jesuit Pierre Coton as his confessor, found him likable and faithful, and devoted himself to the administration of France and the turbulence of love. 5. The Satyr. In the Condé Museum at Chantilly there is a delectable portrait, by Franz Pourbus the Younger, showing Henry in full maturity of power and pride. Lithe of build, simply dressed in baggy breeches and black doublet and hose, left arm akimbo, a ruff under his grey beard, a majestic nose, a firm mouth, eyes alert, skeptical and humane. His many years of campaigning had given him the bearing, morals, and odor of a soldier, strong, active, tireless, too busy to indulge in cleanliness or to duly change his clothes. Sometimes, said a friend, he stank like a corpse. After a day of marching or fighting, he would alarm his aides by organizing a hunt. He was a paragon of courage, but he had a tendency to diarrhea when battle neared, and in his final 7 years he suffered from dysentery, dysuria, and gout. His mind was as mettlesome and resilient as his body. He saw through bunkum readily, seized the essence of matters at once, wrote letters still quick with life, and brightened France and history with his wit. When he named La Vieuville to an office, and the grateful recipient said, biblically, "Lord, I am not worthy," Henry replied, "I know it quite well, but my nephew asked me to appoint you." Once, on his way to dinner, he was stopped by a petitioner who began pompously, "Sire, Agesilaus, King of Lacedaemon." "Ventre Saint Gris," moaned Henry. "I have heard of him, but he had dined and I haven't." He was, says a French historian, the most intelligent of French kings. He was also the most beloved, not yet the most popular. Half of France still accepted him grudgingly, but those who knew him closely were ready to go to the stake for him, some inclusively. He was the most approachable of rulers, unpretentious, natural, good-natured, not quick to take offense, never tardy to forgive. His court complained of his unwillingness to put on the majesty of a king. He allowed poets and playwrights to make fun of him, though he liked it better when Malherbe made him a god of virtue and charm. He went to see the farces that satirized him, and he dulled their barbs with his laughter. He took no revenge on those who had opposed him by deed or speech. "All the forests in my kingdom would not provide enough gibbets if all who have written or preached against me were to be hanged." He was as sensitive as a poet, and felt the poverty of the people almost as keenly as the beauty of women. He was no stoic. Control of his emotions was not among his virtues. He had many faults. He could be thoughtlessly rude and gaily coarse. He had a Rabelais in him. He enjoyed risque stories and told them beyond compare. He gambled too much at cards, lost heavily, cheated often, but always restored his lawless gains. He neglected the pursuit of a retreating enemy to pursue a retreating woman. We must not list all his loves. 3 women in particular marked his road to the throne. To La Belle Corisande he wrote burning billets. I devour your hands and kiss your feet 1,000,000 times. It would be a desolate spot indeed, where we two would be bored together. By 1589 he was bored, and he discovered Esther Imbert de Bois-Lambert. A year later, aged 37 and undeterred by gonorrhea, he lost his heart to Gabrielle d'Estrées, then a girl of 17, whom a poet endued with golden hair, starry eyes, lily throat, pearly fingers, and alabaster breasts. Her lover, Bellegarde, recklessly described her beauty to the king. Henry galloped 12 miles in disguise through enemy terrain to see her. She laughed at his long nose. He fell at her feet. Bellegarde withdrew. She yielded to the charms of Franks and royalty, and bore Henry 3 children. He took her to court and on his hunts, caressed her in public, thought of marrying her if Margot would give him a divorce. Huguenot and Catholic preachers joined in condemning him as an arrant adulterer, and brave Sully reproached him for wasting state funds on courtesans. He begged forgiveness on the plea that, having labored so arduously in war and government, and having fared so ill in marriage, he was entitled, like a good soldier, to some recreation. For 8 years he loved Gabrielle as uxoriously as was possible to a spirit so ondoyant et divers, but Gabrielle became fat and acquisitive. She intrigued against Sully, called him valet. Henry raged, told her that he valued such a minister above 10 such mistresses. He relented and again talked of marrying her, but on April 10, 1599, she died in giving birth to a dead child. He mourned her bitterly and wrote, "The plant of love within me is dead." It revived 2 months later when he met Henriette d'Entragues, daughter of that Marie Touchet who had served Charles IX. Mother, father, and half-brother forbade her to capitulate except for a wedding ring. Henry wrote her a promise of marriage, conditional on her bearing him a son. Sully tore it up before his face. Henry wrote another and delivered it with 20,000 crowns. The lady's conscience cleared, and she became the royal mistress. Some of the king's diplomats thought it time for him to settle down. They persuaded Margot to consent to a divorce, provided Henry would not marry his mistress. Clement VIII agreed to grant a divorce on the same terms, and offered as a bride Maria de' Medici, daughter of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. The Florentine bankers proposed to cancel the huge debt France owed them if Henry made Maria his queen. The marriage was celebrated by proxy at Florence on October 5, 1600. Henry tore himself away from a battlefield to go as far as Lyon to greet his wife. He found her tall and fat and imperious, gave her every royal courtesy, begot Louis XIII, and returned to Mademoiselle d'Entragues. Periodically, however, he performed his marital duties. Marie de Médicis, as France called her, bore him 7 children in 10 years. Henry brought them up, together with his offspring by Gabrielle and Henriette, at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Henriette was presented to the Queen and was lodged in a palace near the Louvre, but having borne a son to the king, she insisted that she, not Marie, was the rightful queen. Her father and half-brother plotted to kidnap her and her son to Spain and to have Philip III acknowledge him as the true Dauphin of France in 1604. The plot was discovered, the brother was arrested, the father was released on returning Henry's promise of marriage. Henry continued to pursue Henriette like a famished satyr. She returned his caresses with disgust and hatred, and accepted bribes from Philip III to serve as a spy for Spain. 6. Assassination. Amid these incredible absurdities, the king schemed to break the cordon with which the Habsburgs had imprisoned France. The iron circle of the Spanish Netherlands, Luxembourg, Lorraine, Franche-Comté, Austria, the Valteline passes, Savoy, Italy, and Spain. Sully, in writing his memoirs, claimed to have proposed to Henry and to James I of England a grand design. France, England, Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, the United Provinces, or Holland, Protestant Germany, Switzerland, and Venice were to unite against the Habsburgs, wrest America from Spain, free Germany from the Emperor, and drive the Spaniards from the Netherlands. Then the victors were to divide all Europe except Russia, Turkey, Italy, and Spain into a federated Christian republic of 15 autonomous states trading with one another without tariffs and submitting their foreign policies to a federal council armed with supreme military force. Henry himself seems never to have entertained this grandiose conception. Probably the limit of his hope was to extend France to natural boundaries at the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the sea, and to liberate her from fear of Spain and Austria. For these ends he resorted to any available means. He sought alliances with the Protestant powers, he helped the Dutch in their revolt against Spain, he planned to support an uprising of Moriscos in Valencia, he encouraged the Turks to attack Austria. A trivial dispute offered to spark this Bourbon-Habsburg enmity into a European war. On March 25, 1609, there died, without issue, Duke John William of the little triune principality of Jülich-Cleves-Berg, near Cologne. The Emperor Rudolph, as its suzerain, claimed the right to name a Catholic to this petty throne. Henry protested that the further subjection of the duchy to the Habsburgs would endanger the eastern boundary of France. He joined Brandenburg, the Palatinate, and the United Provinces in determination to appoint a Protestant successor to John William, and when Archduke Leopold of Austria occupied Jülich with imperial troops, Henry prepared for war. His final romance harmonized fetchingly with this call to Armageddon. Though he was now 56 and looked older, he developed in 1609 an uncontrollable longing for Charlotte de Montmorency, then 16. She rejected his advances, but consented at his behest to marry the new Prince of Condé. "Are you not very wicked," his mistress Henriette is said to have taunted him, "to want to bed with the wife of your son? For you well know that you have told me that he, the prince, was your offspring." Condé fled with his bride to Brussels. Henry itched to pursue her, and Malherbe stitched the royal itches into rhyme. Villeroy, Henry's foreign minister, begged Archduke Albert of the Netherlands to extradite the princess to Paris. The Archduke, encouraged by Philip III of Spain, refused. Villeroy threatened a war that may set fire to the four corners of Christendom. It seemed providential to Henry that Brussels was on the way to Jülich. He would conquer the lady and the Spanish Netherlands as a prelude to shattering the empire and humbling Spain. He hired Swiss mercenaries and prepared to raise an army of 30,000 men. James I of England promised 4,000 more. Catholic France was alarmed. It gave too much credit to the gossip that the charms of the princess were the real casus belli. It noted with dismay that the king's allies and generals were mostly Protestants. It wondered what the fate of Catholicism and the papacy would be in a Europe where the Catholic South had been conquered by the Protestant North and a so recently Huguenot king. The taxes levied to finance the dreaded war lowered Henry's always precarious popularity. Even the court turned away from him as a man too foolish to realize that he could no longer be Lothario and Alexander in one. Prophecies were bandied about, perhaps as hopeful provocations to the suggestible that he would soon be killed. François Ravaillac of Angoulême heard the prophecies. Arrested for a crime that he had not committed, he brooded in his prison, had visions, studied theology, read tracts defending tyrannicide. Strong of arm, weak of mind, he dallied with the idea that God had chosen him to fulfill the prophecies, to save France from Protestant doom. Released, he went to Paris in 1609, lodged with Madame d'Escoumont, a friend of Henriette d'Entragues, and confessed to her that he had thoughts of killing the king. A warning was sent to Henry, but he was so accustomed to such alarms that he took no notice of it. As Henry passed through the streets, Ravaillac tried to approach him. Soldiers stopped him. He said he wished to ask the king if it was true that he was planning war against the Pope, and that the Huguenots were preparing to massacre the Catholics. He tried to enter a monastery and to join the Jesuits. He was rejected. He went back to Angoulême to perform his Easter duty. He received the sacrament and, from a monk, a little bag containing, he was told, a fragment of the cross on which Christ had died. He bought a knife and returned to Paris. Madame d'Escoumont sent a warning to Sully, who transmitted it to the king. Henry was preparing to join his army at Châlons. On May 13, 1610, he appointed the queen as regent during his absence. On the 14th, the Duke of Vendôme, his natural son, begged him to stay at home, for predictions of his assassination had named this as the fatal day. In the afternoon, he decided to take a carriage ride, visit the sick Sully, and get a breath of air. To avoid being noticed, he dismissed his guards, but he was accompanied by 7 members of the court. Ravaillac, who had been watching the Louvre, followed the carriage. At a point in the Rue de la Ferronnerie, it was stopped by a traffic tangle. Ravaillac leaped upon the step and struck the king so powerfully that the blade pierced the heart. Henry died almost instantly. Ravaillac, put to the torture, took full responsibility for his action, denied that he had any abettors or accomplices, mourned the violence of his act, but professed confidence that God would forgive it, as in a sacred cause. His limbs were torn from his body by 4 horses. His trunk was burned in a public square. Many accused the Jesuits of having inflamed the assassin's mind. It was pointed out that Mariana's De Rege, justifying tyrannicide, had been openly sold in Paris shops. The Jesuits replied that this book had been explicitly condemned by an assembly of Jesuits held in Paris in 1606. The Sorbonne judged the Jesuits guilty of dangerous doctrines and officially burned Mariana's book. Marie de Médicis, as regent, protected the Jesuits from harm and accepted their guidance in faith and policy. France was confused and divided by Henry's final enterprise and sudden death. A minority accepted the assassination as an act of God in defense of the Church, but the great majority, Catholic as well as Protestant, mourned the passing of a king whose labors for his people far outweighed his errors, follies, and sins. Frenchmen had not forgotten the poverty and desolation, the religious turmoil, the official corruption and incompetence that he had inherited with the throne, and they saw now a nation cleansed and orderly, prosperous despite high taxation, and powerful enough to challenge the long ascendancy of Spain. They remembered fondly Henry's simplicity of dress and conduct and speech, his good humor and kindly nature, his gay courage in war, his tact in friendship and diplomacy. And their own moral laxity condoned those amorous escapades in which he had but shown himself a man after their own desires. He had with Warrant called himself a loyal king, faithful and true. He was also the most human and humane of French kings, and he was the savior of France. His plan to extend France to natural boundaries may have seemed impracticable, but Richelieu, 20 years later, followed it, and Louis XIV carried it through. Soon after his death, Europe agreed in calling him Henry the Great. In the French Revolution, all the French kings who succeeded him were condemned, but Henry IV remained supreme in the affections of the people.